Welcome into the latest Five on the Floor on the 5 Reasons Sports Network, also on Dash Radio every day, Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. Pacific. Check out 5reasonsports.com. We're growing there. We're free. There's no paywall. Paywall sucks. So make sure you check out 5reasonsports.com. Brady Hawk's putting up stories as soon as the game ends, his 5 takeaways, and also all the highlights of the Heat pressers. Plus, we do the Marlins stuff there. They acquired Starling Marte. Yesterday, all the Dolphins stuff with Tua, Fitzpatrick, and everything else that we do there on the website. Also, check out our YouTube channel and our great sponsors, all of which are here local in South Florida. They're all Miami sports fans like you are. And one of them, our new one, is Mark Brown, PA. Now, this is a law firm that does real estate litigation and transaction stuff, commercial and residential, with a full-service attorney-owned title company, which can come in very, very handy when you're looking for properties. $295 closing fee on all refinances and purchases when mentioning 5 Reasons. That's a $295 closing fee on all refinances and purchases when mentioning 5 Reasons. They handle evictions for landlords and tenants. They also offer flat fee evictions. They've been practicing for nearly 15 years. The best way to reach Mark is 954-566-5678. Again, that's 954-566-5678. The website again, Mark, that's with a C, M-A-R-C, brownpa.com. And now, today's episode.
Welcome to 5 on the Floor, a Miami Heat and NBA podcast from Ethan Skolnick with Alphonse Sidney, a.k.a. Alf 954. Brought to you by the 5 Reasons Sports Network.
All right, Ethan Skolnick back on 5 on the Floor. Here's today's floor plan. I'm going to start with Greg Sylvander and with Alphonse Sidney. We're going to get you ready a little bit for Game 2. We're also going to do a pregame stream before the 6:30 games. That'll be around 6 o'clock on Wednesday prior to Game 2 as the Heat take a 1-0 lead into Game 2 against Giannis and the Bucks. But also in this episode, I had a chance to sit down for about 35, 40 minutes with Frank Isola. You probably know him as someone who covered the Knicks during all those Heat and Knicks years, but now he's on PTI. He's on Around the Horn. He's a host on Sirius XM NBA. We're going to talk about the event of the day, which was really the 25-year anniversary of Pat Riley agreeing, not just agreeing, he probably agreed before, but of coming to the Miami Heat for a first-round pick that ended up turning into Walter McCarty, of all things. And, of course, over the past 25 years, Riley's won 3 championships, made it to 5 finals. I believe only missed the playoffs 5 times. I'll have to look that up. While the Knicks have been swirling the drain for about a decade. So I'm going to talk to Frank Isola about that. Before we do, though, going to bring in Alf and Greg. Let's get to some of the news of the day. The big story in this series, now Spoelstra, Nunn, and Dragic had pressers. We'll get to those. The big story in this series is the way that Giannis is being responded to around the NBA, around social media, for his comment where he didn't really understand why he was asked, why he should have had to guard or asked to guard Jimmy Butler at the end of Game 1. Of course, Jimmy went for 40, mostly against Chris Middleton, but also against others. How did you receive that today, Greg? Kind of the way that Giannis was taken to task by other NBA players like Isaiah Thomas, of all people, on Twitter.
Yeah, it was loud, and I couldn't help but think that he's going to feel some level of pressure or obligation to at least slide over onto Jimmy a little bit more, particularly if Jimmy has it going. When you're the defensive player of the year, the way, and you know, you're the status of Giannis, you're expected to guard the best player on the other team. So as out of left field the question was at the time because of matchups and things like that, I think that when you get deeper into this series, if Jimmy is dictating stuff the way that he did in Game 1, he's going to have to do some of that. And it opens up a ton of questions about how the Bucks will match up otherwise. Particularly with all the 3-guard stuff that was talked about amongst players today as well. So it's going to definitely shift the series, but it felt like it was just off one game. Giannis is already hearing people barking at him, and I don't know that he's had a ton of that this year, and so it'll be interesting to see how he comes out in Game 2.
Alf, what do you make of the perception of him around the NBA? I get the sense sometimes that other NBA players don't put him on quite the same pedestal that they do LeBron and maybe even Kawhi.
Well, you know what it feels like? It feels like LeBron in Cleveland, right? Where it's darling of the league, and then all the eyes start focusing on him, and then you start seeing the holes in his game. And now it's about how does he respond? I think people are nitpicking him, but listen, you can't come out in a game where people are saying every pundit is saying you have a problem against the Miami Heat. They scheme really well against you. You can't come out that game and have 18 points and then wonder why people are questioning why didn't you guard the guy that was killing you down the stretch. So Giannis just isn't used to this yet. So I think, and the rest of the NBA has watched him ascend without ever having to answer any hard questions. No, the Milwaukee media isn't notorious for asking the hard questions. So so he's hid in the Midwest, and he's the darling. People talk, it's his charity work and how great he is with kids. But now it's crunch time, and you're the best team in the league for the second year in a row. You're the league MVP for the second year in a row. No one's going to give you the Mo Williams, the built-in excuses of he doesn't have a team around him anymore. You only get that for a little while, and then everyone starts having those expectations of you. So we're going to see how he responds to it. And to me, that's one of the most interesting things about the series, because if they lose in 5 or 6 to the Miami Heat, a 5th seed, I mean, the entire league is coming for his neck. And then does he cut and run and find a team and try to win, or does he stick it out and, become a punching bag?
Well, and that puts Mike Budenholzer in a really challenging position going into next year, because if you can't attract elite talent this offseason, then you got to look to change something. And I feel like Bud may have a little bit of that fall on his neck too. I mean, we'll see where that goes, but I do think that somebody's going to get blamed, and Giannis will take some of it, but some of it will get deflected. But this was kind of the master plan, and Riley was up there for game 1. The master plan was, let's get the Bucks in a series. Let's challenge the Bucks. Let's try to beat the Bucks. And at the same time, we're going to make Giannis think about his situation. They have an opportunity to do all of those things. All right, let's get to the next.
Wait, do you think Bud's in trouble? Because I think he's in trouble.
I think
absolutely.
I think anytime a coach puts up that many wins in the regular season but doesn't end up converting in the playoffs, they're when they have a huge start, they're in some trouble.
And then you see the obvious things like Pat Connaughton playing way too many minutes, Marvin Williams playing too many minutes, Giannis not playing enough minutes. There are real questions about his rotations and about his decisions.
Well, I think about his adjustments is the biggest thing. And look, they're down 0-1. There are some things they're going to need to adjust to from game 1. I think that they made an adjustment that worked at times, but not completely. Their adjustment was, we're gonna guard the 3, which is something that they haven't done a lot this season. They guarded it pretty well, but Dragic and Butler, and we're going to talk about Goran next, got wherever they wanted the whole game. And so ultimately, although it's funny, I didn't think the Heat shot the 3 that well, and I looked up and they shot 38%, on pretty high volume or decent volume. So none of it worked. But I wonder if Bud goes back to the defense that he ran the whole season. But if he hadn't, and that hadn't worked, people would say he didn't adjust. So he's kind of getting caught in this no-win situation now, unless they win the series. I do want to get to Goran. He spoke today, and I want to get to this because I want to claim that my theory was right, even though nobody understood my theory, including myself. Goran Dragic basically acknowledged today that the reason he's playing so well is this feels like Eurobasket to him, which we talked about many times. But he said basically because he's just with his teammates, and he didn't even tell his family to come, just like Jimmy. Most of the players are having their families there. He told his family to stay in Europe. He says, there's nothing for my 2 young kids to do here anyway. I got the sense from Goran today that he's on a complete mission. If you haven't seen it on the court, it came through in his words today. He said, this is not my first rodeo. I think Goran Dragic, in the last year of his deal, when he was kind of sort of traded this offseason, wants to show that he's an elite guard in the NBA. And so far, through 5 games of the playoffs, he is.
Yeah, and I mean, the contract year stuff is inevitable. That will point to some of that in terms of, this is like the perfect moment for any impending unrestricted free agent that has any sort of option or anything like that to their value in this type of setting because of everyone's short memories. But all that aside, he just looks like a guy that sees an opportunity. I really think that this team is more and more starting to visualize themselves being able to actually get this thing. And I know Jimmy has talked about, we're a team that we can win this year. And I believe that Jimmy's going to say that. It's another thing for the entire team to start to take on that persona. And I think Goran has really exhibited that in the bubble, particularly in the playoffs, and the shooting and stuff obviously helps as well. So he's the key to the series ultimately when you think about the matchup with Bledsoe. He outplayed George Hill. So it's good to see him so free and at peace, and he looks like he's having a lot of fun.
And we've talked about it a lot, Ethan, right? The relief points. I mean, I bring it up over and over again because it just feels like in that first half, it felt like like the Heat were going to go into halftime down 12 to 15 points. And the only reason they weren't is because of Goran Dragic. Like, a lot of guys were struggling. Duncan Robinson wasn't hitting his shots. I mean, Jimmy scored most of his points in the second half. That first half, Goran Dragic kept him in the game. And you have to think right now, is he not a top 10 offensive player in these playoffs? I mean, look at the numbers. I mean, he's averaging 23, 24 points. I mean, he's over 5 assists and rebounds like every single game. What he's doing right now is absolutely amazing, especially for a guy his age who a lot of people, including myself, thought that he just didn't have that much left in the tank. But one thing that we talked about all summer long is him coming off the bench, playing limited minutes, and how important a healthy Goran Dragic was going to be to this Heat team in the playoffs. And we're seeing it now. And one thing I noticed last game, we've been complaining that Spo would just ride Goran for 12 minutes in the fourth quarter. He actually this time put Duncan Robinson in for a few minutes to spell Goran and brought him right back. So I think Spo's seeing it too that, listen, Goran's super important. They got to keep him healthy. But we said all year, a healthy Goran Dragic is huge for this team.
Yeah, and he actually said that he didn't like the long rest. He said that today. He said he was concerned with the week layoff. The first series against Indiana, I felt great. I didn't want to lose that consistency. The coaches did an amazing job in practice trying to simulate the game. But there was not arrogance. Goran's not arrogant, but he is defiant, okay? That's been my experience with him. He's one of the nicest guys you'll meet, but he believes in himself. And he said today, I asked him, I said, this is the best you've played for an extended stretch in a long time. He said, this is not my first rodeo, but of course, this is the best basketball I've played in the playoffs. All right, last thing I want to get to here is Kendrick Nunn. Eric Spoelstra talked about a bunch of things. You can find it on 5 Reasons Sports, but I do want to get to the Isola interview tonight. He did talk about Kendrick Nunn, and he talked about how happy he is for Kendrick, that he's found a role. Kendrick did speak to us and said, Coach told me I'm part of the rotation right now. He also said that he finally feels he has his rhythm back. Did it limited minutes yesterday, 16 minutes, Alf, but it did look like he had his rhythm back enough that you can trust him.
Yeah, he looked trustworthy yesterday. He also wasn't blowing defensive assignments left and right. I feel like the whole team defended really well. They kept talking about it on the broadcast. They were staying in front of their guys, and one of those guys was Kendrick, staying in front of his man. I think there's more guys, surprisingly, to hide Kendrick on the Bucks than there are against some other teams. Like, you throw him on Pat.
Very true.
You throw him on Connaughton. You know what I'm saying? You throw him on Connaughton. You throw on some of these guys or a Corver who, yes, he's going to run you around screens, but he's going to stay beyond the three-point line, and he's not going to penetrate. So there are guys you can hide a guy like Kendrick on, but even with hiding or not, he played well. He stayed in front of his man, and he played within the flow of the offense, right?
Yeah, I mean, everything was positive from him, and this is a huge element for the Heat because they need shot creation, and there's going to be moments where when you talk about relief points, Kendrick Nunn can go get a bucket at times, you know what I mean? So anything that he's doing to round into form and gain confidence is huge. But another interesting wrinkle is just seeing Spoelstra balance the ninth man situation and really being able to look at it situationally, look at it from a positional perspective when you're cross matches and and just like what works. Because like in this series, it's Kendrick Nunn. They're seeing that this 3-guard, let's size them down because that's when we can beat them, may work. And then you see it could be Derrick Jones Jr. in the next series. And it's just it's refreshing to see a roster this deep. And Kendrick Nunn is he's definitely clawing back some of his trade value too for all of my transaction friends out there.
Well, the other thing I think that changes is we're speaking here. Boston just went up 2-0 on Toronto, and we got to start looking at that because, that's a series I expected to go 6 or 7 games. The Celtics came back to win this one, even though Kemba got off to such a slow start. And you look at Kendrick Nunn was not good against Toronto in the 3 games he faced him this year. He was awful. He was better against Boston. And so I'm just wondering about that we may be looking at another change in matchups. I don't think you got to go super big against Boston. You might, see Myers Leonard against Toronto in some circumstances against Marc Gasol and some of the bigs that they use. But I do think it will be situational. We've kind of covered that, and it's going to lead to some interesting episodes when we get into what do they do with Derrick Jones Jr. this offseason if he does not play a big role the rest of the playoffs. All right, just one more comment I want to get to from Eric Spoelstra, and then we're going to turn this over to my interview with Frank Isola. He basically said today about Jimmy Butler. In fact, I can now find it. He said that he was asked. I asked him actually. That's why I remember the question about the jumper, and that Eric said all year, I don't want to talk about that. We're getting playmaking. We're getting leadership. Jimmy's great at all these other things. But today he did acknowledge that in some of their bigger games, he had the mid-range game working. And I'm trying to find the exact quote. I'm not finding it offhand. But that does, if he's making shots like that, how much is that going to open up their offense?
All right, he turned into you're not even a 3-level scorer, 4 levels because he gets to the free throw line so much. Right? It's kind of ridiculous. Now, I hope the the fan base is not counting on this to be a consistent thing. I hope it is, right? And Leif, you've heard me say it. You've seen me on the Twitter timeline that he makes those threes when they count. And it reminds us of somebody who was not always the greatest shooter, but when they counted, he would hit them. And it reminds you a little bit of Dwayne when it comes in crunch time. He'll hit those big shots.
And another key element with Jimmy is that he looks like he has his legs back, and that's huge. Yeah, like he's even like take the 3-point shooting out of it, just get into the bucket and dunking is something that there were moments throughout the season where I thought to myself, I thought Jimmy Butler dunked a little bit more than this. You know what I mean? And then like you start to see it in the playoffs and you're like, okay, this is that Jimmy buckets that they talked about. And we knew it was there. And the more that he taps into it, it's so fun to watch. I mean, to have an alpha like this, 40-point games. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that Heat fans want to get back to as quickly as possible.
Well, I always remember what Dwayne and LeBron used to say. They would say that, Mike Miller and James Jones and to a certain degree Rashard Lewis and Ray Allen and Shane Battier were shooters. They were shot makers. When Jimmy is on, the whole buckets thing comes from him being a shot maker, that he can score from various places. It just didn't happen a lot this year. Here's the exact quote, and then we're going to get into the Isola interview. He said some of the most competitive games this year, he was really effective from mid-range and those short floaters. When you play against really good defensive teams, he can go to that part of the game, and that's needed in the playoffs. All right, we're going to get to Frank Isola here in a second. Before we do, I want to tell you about another great sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network, and I'm going to grab a couple of these after I'm done because it's been a long day, and that's Biscayne Bay Brewing. The Biscayne Bay Brewing Company is the official beer of Inter Miami, which is on the verge of another big acquisition. Follow our Austin Robillard for that. Also of the Miami Marlins, who are still in a playoff spot right now, but I think we're actually having the best year. They're the official, actual independent brewery of 5 Reasons Sports. They're owned by local guys who employ people in this community to make their beer right here in South Florida. These guys are committed to our community and support 5 Reasons Sports so we can keep bringing you all the local sports content that you can handle. If you care about supporting local business and drinking amazing beer, grab their stuff, whether it's Marlins Lager, Miami Pale Ale, or Tropical Bay IPA. I got more of it, Alf, at all major retailers throughout South Florida. It's the beer we're drinking. at 5 Reasons Sports. And before we get to the interview, 2 codes that you should know about if you want discounts. Go to mybookie.ag if you want to bet on sports, any kind of sports. Enter 5 on the floor, and you will double your deposit. And if you want to clean yourself up a little bit, you got to go to manscaped.com. Use the code for this one, 5RSN. That's for 5, the number 5, RSN for Reasons Sports Network. And you will get 20% off
Ethan,
your order.
You got to be like Pat Riley and leave the Knicks behind, man.
That is a great segue.
Manscaped.com.
Eric, one other quick thing. Today's the 25-year anniversary of the Knicks trading Pat Riley to the Miami Heat for a first-round pick that became Walter McCarty. Obviously, that turned out to be a pretty good trade.
Yeah.
Can you
anniversary today?
25 years today, September 1st, 1995. I'm just curious, how did you receive that news at the time?
Super nervous. I thought I would probably be out, and I would have been out if it didn't end the way it did. He couldn't bring anybody from New York, but if he could have, he was going to bring Jeff. I had heard, and probably his whole staff. He was definitely going to bring his video guy. So I thought I was the very strong potential that I was going to be out. Without a job going into coaching in September, that's a tough timing. But I had already had some good experience working, for the draft, so I was cool with that. But I was definitely nervous. Obviously, you fast forward now, and I'm just extremely grateful for all these years, working for the Godfather. He really has been an incredible blessing in my life. It's you're not gonna get me emotional now. That just takes me down memory lane. Everybody knows how I feel about Pat and how good. It kind of surprised me right now. A little emotional, but he's been great for the franchise. That partnership of the Rileys and the Arisons, that'll go down all time in sports, and how they've transformed this franchise, but also the city of Miami. Been a great boost.
All right, welcome back to 5 on the Floor on the 5 Reasons Sports Network, found every day on Dash Radio, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. on the Nothing But Net channel. That's Eastern Time, or 7 to 8 a.m. Pacific. Now, today, as we noted earlier in the episode, is the 25th anniversary of Mickey Arison acquiring Pat Riley in a trade for a first-round pick that turned into the illustrious Walter McCarty out of Kentucky. And so, obviously, the past 25 years for the Miami Heat have gone a little bit better than the past 25 years for the New York Knicks. I believe the Heat have only missed the playoffs 4 times. We've got Frank Isola here, who covered the Knicks for both tabloids in New York. And now, of course, you can find him on Around the Horn, PTI, and on Sirius XM NBA every morning. How many times consecutively have the Knicks missed the playoffs, Frank?
Oh, my God. Now you're really putting me on the spot. Is it 7 straight years? I think the last time they made the playoffs was when they got to the second round, which, by the way, that was the year where they beat Miami either 2 or 3 times. And they ended up winning. The Knicks that year won 54 games, beat Boston. That was the end of the Kevin Garnett, Ray Allen was gone by then, Paul Pierce. And then they ran into Indiana, and they ended up losing in 6 games. A famous play with Roy Hibbert blocking Carmelo at the rim with about 4 minutes to go in the fourth quarter of Game 6. That kind of turned the game, and the Knicks ended up losing. But that year, they had actually fared very well against the Miami Heat, and they felt pretty confident. Now, do I think if they had gone down there, would they have beaten Miami? No, I don't think so. But I think they could have taken 2 games. So that really, in the last 20 years, that is like, the one shining Knicks season, that year when they finally got out of the first round for the first time since 2000 and made a little run.
All right, so we're going to get back into the history of 95 and everything. We might actually have Mike Wise join us at some point, who broke a lot of those stories when he was working at the New York Times at the time. But I do want to go to a little bit more kind of present day with you before we head all the way back there. If you could sort of summarize, I know this is difficult because you've written hundreds of thousands of words on this, but if you could summarize what's happened to the Knicks since 1995, and obviously the brief Van Gundy era, and then everything after. How would you even do that?
I still think that after Pat Riley left, which was devastating for the Knicks in so many ways, because you think about what he's accomplished in Miami, and I've said this for the longest time. I always say the worst thing that's happened to the Knicks in the last 25 years is that Pat Riley left, because I do believe if he had stayed there, I'm going to be fair. I think the Knicks could have won 2 titles, because I just think that he, look what he did in Miami. I believe he could have done something very similar in New York. But, after he left, they struggled to adjust to Don Nelson, even though when Don Nelson was fired, you want to talk about how things have changed in New York. Don Nelson was fired. He was the coach that replaced Pat Riley. He was fired at 34-25. Mm-hmm. He was 9 games over 500. If a coach in New York was 9 games over 500 right now, in the season is in March, they're going to give the guy a contract extension. So then they went back to Jeff. So you still had, Jeff Van Gundy. So Jeff had learned at the right hand of Pat Riley, and you still had that core. You still had Patrick Ewing, Charles Oakley, John Stark. So they still were the Knicks. And then, they did make it to a finals in 99, got to a conference finals in 2000. But really the change was ownership and Jim Dolan taking on a more prominent role. Jeff ended up leaving in December of 2001, and that's really when everything turned. It was more of an ownership thing. You can tell they were kind of hanging on a little bit by a string. After Pat left, they were able to regroup a little bit. They did, again, make that finals run the year that they, as the 8th seed, obviously they knocked out Miami. You didn't have Michael Jordan around. It was a lockout shortened season. A lot of factors probably played into the Knicks' hand. But it really was, the Knicks started to feel the loss of Pat Riley once Patrick was traded and Charles Oakley was gone and Jeff Van Gundy was gone, kind of all the people that kind of were, molded by Pat Riley. Once you got rid of all of them, then everything changed.
Yeah, I mean, like they talk down here, culture, right? Like the culture changed. I know Jeff kept it going up there for a little while. And those years, though, I mean, those late 90s years, I mean, it wouldn't be fair to say that the Knicks missed Riley that much because they kept beating him. I mean, they beat him 3 out of 4, even while being the lower seed in every series. Every series, and I know you covered all of them like I did, every series went the max, which I don't think we'll ever see that again. 4 straight years where every series went to the final game. And obviously, Charlie Ward, P.J. Brown, Jeff Van Gundy, and Zoe, Sprewell, and Hardaway. We know all of that stuff. But I guess the first 4 or 5 years after Pat left, there really wasn't seller's remorse, was there?
I think even at the time, I think, the Knicks were winning in the short term. And I think, if you had said back then, Pat Riley's going to be there for 25 years, then you're really thinking, oh, this is going to be bad. Because nobody in New York is going to last that long. And we didn't know at the time about Jim Dolan and how impulsive he can be and short-tempered and wanting to move people in and out of the front office. So, you look at Miami, Pat Riley goes down there. You have an owner in Mickey Arison who believes in Pat Riley. He lets him run the show. They've had 3 coaches since then. I mean, the Knicks have had, I think, 3 coaches in the last few months, right? From David Fizdale to Mike Miller and now Tom Thibodeau. It's just different the way things are run. And I think, obviously, Pat Riley has a lot to do with it. And you mentioned it about, the some years where they didn't make the playoffs. And wasn't there one year where Miami won, was it 17 games or 21? 15 games. And I think, yeah. and Ethan, I think that's what it is. The fact that, so every year wasn't perfect, but they never deviated from the plan and their core values and things like that. And Pat Riley was still always going to be in charge. And they set a foundation where when LeBron came in and you could tell, they were going to try to pin everything on Eric Spoelstra, Pat Riley didn't do that. So it's just a different mentality to me. And I've written this before and I've said this before. Every year that the Knicks are looking for a new front office, which to be fair is almost every year, I always felt the first call I would make would be to Pat Riley. I would call him up. And then as crazy as this sounds, I would call up Bill Belichick and tell him to come in and be the president of the team. You just needed that kind of organizational structure. And you look at teams like New England, you look at teams like the Miami Heat, the San Antonio Spurs, there are certain organizations that just do it the right way. And clearly, as much as I like to goof on the people in Miami, I mean, come on. It's one of the marquee franchises in professional sports, not just the NBA. Now,
I don't know if we'll be able to get Wise on here, so I want to ask you about this because you were there during all that stuff. So in the simplest terms, and I went back and read the articles today, and obviously I know quite a bit of the history from the Riley side, but also from those who were covering the Knicks at the time, because as I've acknowledged, I was rooting for the Knicks at the time. I was in grad school in 95 at Columbia, and I was a Knicks fan. And then a year later, I was covering the Heat. So all of that changed. But I have some background on it. But for people who don't understand it, what was it about between Pat Riley and Dave Checketts?
And I think
why did it get to that point?
I just think that Dave Checketts, there was probably a couple of things. He probably didn't believe that someone should do both jobs, which not everyone can do both jobs, but there are certain guys that can perform both jobs, be the president of the team and also be the head coach. And by then, Pat Riley had accomplished a lot. So it wasn't like you were doing what Boston did with Rick Pitino, where you're just handing him the keys to the entire franchise. Even though Rick Pitino is a talented guy and had some experience in the NBA, Pat Riley's still at a different level. So maybe I think there was something there. And I also think it's probably had a lot to do with power. Maybe Dave Checketts on some level thought that he was going to be losing some of his influence in the Garden. I always felt it was the wrong play by the Knicks. I just think that Pat Riley is a different kind of guy. Now, in his heart of hearts, did he think, you know what, in New York, there's always, this corporate world, and it's like there are a bunch of sharks swimming here, and it's always been difficult. And listen, ever since he's left, think about how it's worked out. Did he probably think that and said, you know what, I can go to Miami, I could start something on my own, I can make a ton of money, I get the warm weather of Florida. I don't even think that he probably thought it would turn out this good in Miami like it did. It's been better than expected. And I think when you just mentioned those 4 years where they played the Knicks in the playoffs and lost 3 times, that probably had him thinking maybe I made the wrong choice. But at that time, Pat Riley, like when he came to the Knicks, and I was a Knicks fan, so when he came to the Knicks, I remember thinking, I cannot believe that Pat Riley is coaching the Knicks. This is Pat Riley of all people. To me, right away, it made the Knicks legitimate. And there was always this talk about Patrick Ewing not wanting to be there, and then Pat Riley met with him, and of course Patrick Ewing was all in. I'm like, this is the guy you want. It's Pat Riley. And those teams, for a team that never won a championship, and they made it to a Game 7 in 94 against the Houston Rockets, that's a beloved team because, they just fit the identity of people in New York. People in New York love the fact that, they were physical, they were tough, they were kind of the underdog. Michael Jordan is flying above the rim, and here's like the grit and grind New York Knicks. And I think I thought Greg Anthony said it great in the documentary Winning Time, with the Knicks and Reggie Miller, where he said we were either going to win the game or we were going to win the fight. We were getting out of there with a win somehow. And I think that kind of sums up the Knicks from that era under Pat Riley.
Well, Pat gave a speech a few years ago at the stadium. I think I've told this on 5 on the Floor before. Don Shula was supposed to be that day, but he was ill. So Pat sort of had the stage to himself. And he started talking a lot about his Knicks days, more than I anticipated. I've got a lot of Snowbird Dolphin fans down here. So I guess it shouldn't have stunned me too much because it was at the stadium. And he started talking about the marketing campaign. It's
great.
And that, I guess it was his second year. Was his second year in New York where they came to him and said, well, we're going to do this flowery marketing campaign. He's like, no.
Yep.
Chalk outlines. That's what we want. That's who we are. And so they did establish that. And I do think what's interesting is that the Pat Riley of Miami, to me, owes itself more to the Pat Riley of New York than the Pat Riley of LA. I mean, we can talk about getting LeBron and Dwayne and the flashy players he had here, but the cornerstones of the Miami team have always been toughness, grit, work ethic, not Showtime-ish as much, much more like, and if you look at what Pat's done here, particularly with Eric kind of leading the way here the past few years, but the Heat have always found, since Riley's been here, the overlooked player, the Vashawn Leonard, the Ike Austin, the Anthony Carter, and now present day, I mean, before they paid them, Tyler Johnson, Hassan Whiteside, now Kendrick Nunn, Duncan Robinson, Malik Allen, Mike James. I mean, all Udonis Haslem, right? Joel Anthony, all these undrafted guys. And really that started in New York, with Starks and Mason.
Right. CBA guys.
Yep. And so I do think that, we've always said, Levitard always says this, that we kind of got Schenectady Riley instead of Showtime Riley down here. What do you think is the biggest lesson he learned from the New York days?
And I do think, in the Schenectady part, I was going to say that. I think that's really Pat Riley, Schenectady, New York, like a grimy kind of town and a tough town. and that's what he brought to New York. And I also think it tells you a lot about him as a basketball executive and talent evaluator. So you're in LA, you got Magic Johnson. So you kind of let Magic Johnson run the show. And it's the Showtime Lakers. And, they got Magic, Kareem. Their third option is James Worthy. Their third option is the top 50 player of all time. I mean, come on. And then your fourth option is Byron Scott. You got Michael Cooper. You come to New York, he doesn't have those players. So he feels like I'm going to have to, and we're going up against Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. We're going to have to wrestle these guys to try to beat him. And I think when he got down to Miami, and you rattled off the names, I would always think about that when they were playing each other in the late 90s. And especially since Jeff was a disciple of Pat Riley, I thought Alonzo Mourning, I could see him in a Knick uniform. And then later on, Udonis Haslem, you could see him in a Knick uniform. And I always loved being at the games with Tim Hardaway. And I've told him this over the years. Yeah, I felt kind of corny saying it to him, but I could tell they actually appreciate it when I said it. I said, I really respected and appreciated watching you play. I just thought you were so good. I could tell you weren't always healthy. Your knee probably was bothering you, but you always, came to play. You made big shots. And I think Pat Riley took what he had in New York, figured this is where I'm going to start in Miami, but look how much the league has changed and look how much the Miami Heat have changed. Look what they are now. They're Duncan Robinson, taking 9 shots. The 9 shots that he takes in one game are 3-pointers. So he's been willing to adjust with the times, and he set up a great thing. And you mentioned Dwayne Wade. He inherited Magic and Kareem in L.A. He drafted Dwayne Wade. So 4 other teams had an opportunity to draft him. He's the one that drafted Dwayne Wade, which got everything started. You talk about player development. He's developing Lamar Odom and Caron Butler, which enables them to get Shaquille O'Neal. So everything is tied to how their organization is connected. And then, the one big year in free agency, they knock it out of the park with LeBron and you make the finals 4 straight times. But they've won. They won before LeBron showed up. They won with LeBron, and they'll probably, at this rate, they're probably going to win again without LeBron.
So let's go back again to the problems in New York without a salesman like him. If he had stayed as you're entering the sort of the period of free agency, I mean, I know you say how badly they need someone like him at the top of the depth chart, right, or the organizational chart, but how different? I mean, I guess if James Dolan's in charge of the team, I don't know how much it would have changed. I don't know if Pat could have worked for James Dolan for very long, to be honest. My guess is no. But how much does it change? Because New York, as you know, has kind of become a laughing stock in free agency. And okay, we're going to swing for Kevin Durant. We're going to get Julius Randle.
Yep.
How does it look if Pat Riley's in charge when you're entering that period?
And I think, everyone talks about Doc Rivers, and I think, Doc Rivers as a coach, it's a different thing right now than where Pat Riley is, but he just has instant credibility, and he's just a guy that for whatever reason resonates with all these players. I think the players, we've seen some goofy things that he's done, dancing with that genie outfit on, and, he's a big Bruce Springsteen fan. He's probably less connected with players than he ever was, but I still think players think of him as the ultimate cool guy. That was his reputation for the longest time. And after all these years, he hasn't coached in forever. I think that still resonates with people. But something that Jeff Van Gundy told me years ago, I was so happy when he told me this because I always liked Pat Riley. I always admired him. I think he's phenomenal. I joke around about on the radio. I said, that's the whale that we got to get. There are 2 people. We got to get Michael Jordan and Pat Riley. That's who I want to talk to. But Jeff Van Gundy had said that Pat Riley every single day woke up thinking about how do I go about winning a championship? And you could say, well, I'm sure other teams do that. I'm not so sure they do. And I remember asking him, what was he like after game 7 when you lost to the Houston Rockets? And he said, he was right away thinking about next season. He wasn't going to – listen, I'm sure in his private moments, he's probably gone back and gone over it a million times what the heck happened in that game. They could have won a championship, and that changes everything for everybody. And probably Pat Riley would have been in New York for 10 more years after that. But I just think – had he stayed in New York, I just think he would have put the Knicks in a much different position. They've had too many ownership changes, and you mentioned it, Ethan. The Knicks are all talk. We got this guy, and he's the players love playing for him, and this guy and that guy. There's never really a plan. The plan is just keep my job until the next plan that I come up with. That's all it is, where there's really no foundation for really anything that's going to lead to long-term success.
So let's look at it going forward now. Again, 25 years, in the playoffs 80% of the time, 3 championships, 5 finals. In some ways, I kind of consider this his best rebuild because he kind of did it to himself. I was very critical of him and the organization in 16 and 17 for signing middling players to long-term big contracts. When you're the Miami Heat, you don't need to do that. Just go develop another one or attract another one. You don't need to sign Hassan Whiteside for that. You don't need to sign Dion Waiters and JJ and James Johnson when nobody else was, or Tyler Johnson, which I know was not necessarily his call, that came up from above him. But all of the moves that they made, he basically tied his hands behind his back with all of those moves. And then it's like, oh, we're going to get Jimmy Butler with no cap space by trading a guy who was the number 40 pick in the draft, nice player, but limited in Josh Richardson. And we're somehow going to dump the Hassan contract at the same time without giving anything else of significance up. As someone who covers the NBA at large right now, how do you perceive what he's done the past, year to put the Heat in this position?
Well, there was a year in Memphis where Jerry West selected Drew Gooden. And I think he got rid of him, not even been less than a year. And I think it says something about maybe some of the executives that are more confident in themselves. Mm-hmm. They could recognize that, you know what, maybe I made a mistake here with this guy. I'm gonna change it up. And like I said, it hasn't always been perfect with Pat Riley. There have been a couple of lean years, but look how quickly they bounce back. And I tend to agree with you, because you look at the team that they have, it's players drafted with high picks. It's the big free agent, Jimmy Butler. It's players that they developed, obviously Duncan Robinson, Kendrick Nunn, guys that they've traded for. I mean, come on, Goran Dragic has been terrific all postseason long. So, I mean, right at this moment, he might be the most underrated player in the league, considering what he's been able to do the last few games. I just think what they've done this year, it says a lot about that organization, and you could see kind of a future. And it also, the team just looks connected. When Jimmy Butler's playing for Minnesota, you could tell Karl-Anthony Towns a little jealous probably. Then you go to Philadelphia, and he dragged them to a Game 7 against Toronto. And, but you could tell with Embiid and Ben Simmons there, was it really going to work? Was it going to be some of this petty jealousy? You don't see any of that in Miami. No. It's like Bam Adebayo knows what his role is. Goran Dragic knows what his role is. Duncan Robinson knows. And I thought it was funny when Jimmy Butler came out and said after the Game 1 win, I told them, I got to go in time. I'm not going to pass the ball. I think the players probably completely understood. They were like, yeah, you know what? That actually is the best plan of action right now.
Well, because, he's earned the credibility with them with the way he came in. But what I said from the very beginning is, just like down here at least, because I know obviously the connection between Riley and Magic and Riley and Ewing, but down here, Zoe was the pinnacle of, say, the Riley culture. He was the embodiment. He would say adversity introduces a man to himself, and we're like, okay, he got that from Pat, and then he would repeat it for the next year. Jimmy Butler is Spoelstra's Zoe. Like they are completely connected. And I've told this story on 5 on the Floor, but the first week Jimmy came down testing Eric. I mean, he pushed him. And after a week, he went back to people in his circle and said, I'm not doing it anymore. He's the best coach I've ever played for. And I know you have a relationship with Tibbs, but he put Spo up there from the very beginning. And I feel like he and Spoelstra, it's like this kindred spirit thing where Jimmy's sort of brazenness has gotten Eric to get out of his shell a little bit this year, where he's spoken out a little bit more. And he kind of has a little bit more attitude than he had before. And it just feels like he's his guy. But you're right. It's about establishing a culture. If you put Jimmy Butler in New York, how would that go with his personality?
Exactly. I think what happens to a lot of these guys in New York, they come to New York and like the losing starts, and then it's, well, what else can I do? Can I get into the fashion world? Maybe I can become an actor in New York. It always seems to be everyone's working on their second career when they get to New York. And it's funny, you mentioned Thibodeau, because Tom, if you're ever talking about the NBA, he always talks about Pat Riley. Because I think a lot that Tom learned about the NBA, first from Eric Musselman, but a ton of it from Jeff Van Gundy, all comes down from Pat Riley. So Tom constantly talks about Pat Riley. And he and Jimmy Butler remain close. Tom went down to Miami a couple of times this year, had lunch with him, dinner with him, hung out with Jimmy. What happened in Minnesota, which I thought made Tom look bad, but Tom's maintained a good relationship with Jimmy. Jimmy Butler I think he didn't think that the management, meaning ownership of Minnesota, it would work there. And to be fair, he's kind of been right about that. Look at what's happened since he's left. The thing's gone completely in the toilet. The same thing with Tom leaving.
Yeah. So it's totally changed. I guess it's interesting you mentioned Tibbs and Pat because, of course they butted heads over the Jimmy trade itself, right? Or else, Jimmy might have been in Miami a little bit earlier, but they do have similar philosophies in terms of work ethic. I mean, obviously the minutes, playing your stars a lot. We don't really believe in load management, although the Heat sort of do. They just don't acknowledge it. They've done it over the past few years at times. But it's interesting. There's a lot of similarities between the two. All right, before we close.
One similarity, though, the difference, Pat Riley has he's gotten older. He has a different, he has other interests in life. Tom just wants to coach basketball.
Right.
That's all he wants to do.
Right. Well, like I've said, I mean, Pat could have left this thing a while ago. He has, that front office is loaded. I mean, they've got Ellisberg, they've got Battier, they've got Adam Simon, who's been interviewing all over the place. Chet Kamara is still involved. Obviously, the Arisons. I mean, it's one of the deepest front offices in the league, if not the deepest.
Yeah.
He's still in charge.
Yeah. I wanted to say one thing. The story, oh my God, is it the guy from ESPN that writes the long form? Is it Hunter Thompson?
Oh, Hunter Thompson. Yeah,
Hunter Thompson.
Pat.
Yeah,
yes.
I apologize. I loved, I read the, I read.
No, I'm sorry, Wright Thompson.
Wright Thompson.
I got to correct that.
It sounds like Hunter.
Wright
Thompson.
Thinking, Hunter Thompson's a whole different character.
Yeah,
no movies made about Wright Thompson.
Wright Thompson. He does a really good job. That story, you're reading the story. It was a really good story, but at the end, the quote from Pat Riley, when he said something, what's the most exaggerated story in the NBA right now is that Pat Riley's dead. It was something along those lines, and I was like, this dude's a badass, man. That was I thought, and that's why watching him after game one, when there was that great clip of Jimmy Butler walking off the court and pointing up, and then who's standing there, it's after all these years, it's Pat Riley. It's the whole thing is too cool. It was really awesome.
Well, people were pulling out a graphic today that was from a story that I wrote in 2014 about Riley. It was a graphic of him as the Godfather, and it says, still pulling the strings. And it was from an interview I did in his office after LeBron left, where I was not expecting Pat to unload on LeBron. In fact, I had crafted all kinds of other questions about his career, assuming that he would not let me go there. And then he spent 25 minutes unloading on LeBron on the record. But I remember during that conversation, I said to him, how does this end for you? I mean, this is 2014. We're full 6 years ago. Okay. At this stage, how does this end? Because he was so upset, Frank, that he thought that everybody was going to have barbecues. Okay. That was his thing.
Yeah.
That Heat family was going to stay together forever. And if you look at it, Frank, it's one of the few real ultimate failures, not the era, not the two championships, but the end is one of the few failures of his career down here because everybody left unhappy. Dwayne left unhappy with the way they mangled that in 15 and 16. LeBron left unhappy for his own reasons. Bosh left unhappy, but that was sort of out of the Heat's control. That was illness related. I think they did the right thing. Chalmers left unhappy. Chris Anderson left unhappy. Ray didn't talk to Eric the last year he was here. And the only one who stuck in, and he wasn't happy all the time, also was Haslam. But James Jones and Mike Miller was amnestied. They left unhappy. The whole damn team was unhappy. Okay. Even Shane, is acknowledged, that last year he should have quit the first day of training camp. He just wasn't into it that last season. So they all left unhappy. And so I asked, Pat, I said, how does this end? And he said, well, I want to get one more ring. And then, Chris, his wife, and I are, we're not even going to be in the post-game celebration. We're just going straight to the airport to France and you won't see us again. and that was 6 years ago. And then, then it was after that the Dwayne thing happened and he left. And then I felt like he overreacted by getting overly sentimental because the whole last group had left unhappy. And then he paid guys like Dion Waiters and James Johnson to kind of prove we take care of our guys. And that didn't work. I didn't know, Frank, that there would be this last act for him.
Yeah.
But it looks like there will be.
I always felt I understand what Dwayne Wade means to South Florida. I mean, would it be saying that he's the greatest athlete in South Florida ahead of Dan Marino because he's won championships, right?
He's the most important athlete in South Florida.
Yeah, going down there.
Greatest is hard to say, but because Dan.
The most important, yeah.
The most important, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I always felt that, when you hear guys talk about it, it's always really difficult to say goodbye to a legend. And we all remember Kobe Bryant's last game with the Lakers. A couple of those years there were brutal. He was miserable. His teammates were miserable. His coaches didn't like him. It was not, everyone looked at it a lot differently after he had that amazing last game where he shot the ball, I think 50 times or whatever it was. I always felt from the outside looking in, I always felt that Pat Riley knew, you know what, it's probably better that Dwayne Wade leaves. And when he did, I felt that Pat, it was very calculated when he kind of said, you know what, we made a mistake. You should have been here. Almost like knowing eventually he'll come back. And when he came back in a role that was more suitable for both of them as a backup. And it's amazing. It had, however you want to look at it, kind of a happy ending. I almost think that in a weird kind of way, I almost felt like I feel like it worked out in Pat's favor, and I kind of think it was by design.
I don't think it was by design because being in the middle of it at that time, the disconnect between them was real. The hurt from Dwayne, who I was communicating with a lot, was real. I think he looked at Pat as a father figure and, one that he hadn't had. That's the way it was explained to me by people close to him. And the fact that Pat was not involved in the negotiations in 16, which was in part because things didn't go well in 15 and he had to get out of the way and Henry Thomas had to get out of the way. The late great Henry Thomas. I was a big Henry Thomas fan. Yeah. And they both had to get out of the way. And so it ended up being just the Arisons and Dwayne banging out a 1-year, $20 million deal with the hope that they wouldn't have the same problem the next year. And then, of course, the Heat prioritized Whiteside and Dwayne got upset and Pat didn't really reach out to him and Pat acknowledged after the fact. So I don't think any of it was by design. I do think your other point is right, though. I think it worked out for the best for a lot of reasons. And I think it gave Dwayne a much better send-off than a much more perfect send-off, even without the playoffs, than he would have had if he'd stayed through with his skills declining and perhaps his knees declining further. I mean, I think it's like, as somebody inside the Heat organization, pretty prominent, said to me recently, it was for both ways, the rare thing where distance made the heart grow fonder, both ways. And so it did work out. And I think by it working out, and this is where I want to close with you, by it working out, I think what it's done is, and you can speak this from an NBA perspective, I think it's restored the Heat's overall credibility in the league back to where it was prior to some down years with LeBron leaving, where you had Jimmy Butler directly acknowledging that the way that the Heat sent Wade off was a part of his decision to want to be in an organization like that, where you have, obviously Spoelstra with this development program, but the Heat now are going to have a max slot in 2021. They maintain some flexibility for this offseason, provided there's any money for anybody. They've got as many good young players, rising young players, as any team in the league on cost-controlled contracts, whether it's Hero or Nunn. Eventually they have to extend Bam, but they've got Duncan. Do you see them as a championship threat over the next couple of years, and provided, they can do some things in free agency too?
To me, it still is the number one free agent market because I do think of the weather, the state taxes, and the organization that's there. So I think after LeBron left, and maybe people looked at it a little bit differently than what happened with Dwayne Wade, but I think you're right. I just think everything that's happened, it feels like the Miami Heat are back. It feels like they're on that track again where you look at them as a dangerous and serious player in free agency. They have their act together. You could see where it's trending with them. They're going up. And, hey, you look at the Eastern Conference. To me, you could still make a case for all four of these teams making it to an NBA Finals. So would I be shocked if the Miami Heat were in the Finals, especially where you're only playing on a neutral site and some of these younger guys maybe playing on the road would have impacted them? So they're probably ahead of schedule right now. And like you said, with that cap space that they have in 21, be careful, everyone, because they've done it before. They'll do it again.
Will they do it with Giannis, do you think? Do you think that this would be a place he would look?
I think if Giannis were to leave, I think Miami, Toronto, Golden State. I hope he stays in Milwaukee because, I'm all about these guys staying with the team that drafted them. And, I know they're going to have to do some stuff because right now it doesn't look too good for them. But I think it's going to be Miami, Toronto, or Golden State.
Those are the exact same three I've heard. The only other one that has slipped into the mix with some I've talked to is Dallas.
Yeah.
And obviously there is some relationship with Luka. I think their games fit. Some people don't. I think their games fit, but personality-wise, they seem to fit. And you've got some of the same advantages as Miami. No state tax, pretty good weather, and an organization that's proven it can win in the right circumstances with a proven head coach. Like I do think they're a threat, but I'm with you. I keep hearing Miami and Toronto over and over as the two primary. And that makes sense because those are two of the best developmental organizations in the league right now that can put players. They've proven they can put players around them. They've won titles in the last decade. They would make sense. I do, before I let you go, I got one more. Phil Jackson, the fact that he couldn't do it in New York, does that raise because there's always been this kind of under the surface rivalry between the two of them, and I think in history that will be recorded also with, obviously, it got played up again in Last Dance too. Did that sort of raise Riley's standing at all, the fact that Phil could not get it done in that other role, whereas Pat could?
I think there's a little truth to that. I think there is some truth to that. And I think, when Pat Riley was younger when he went to Miami, I also think he had a plan. I don't think that Phil Jackson had a plan when he came to New York. I think he got caught up in romanticizing about, winning here in New York, and he won with those Knicks teams, for late 60s, early 70s that people still talk about. Here was my thing about Phil Jackson. At his press conference, he got up there and said, he talked about Red Holzman and the Knicks and what it meant to him and coming home. And I'm thinking, okay, but you didn't come home for $5 million a year. You didn't even come home for $10 million a year. I think he got about 15. So yeah, you could talk about all the sentimental stuff, but they still had to pay you a lot of money for you to even consider coming here. And he just, at that time, I didn't think it was going to work out. Everyone in the media wanted him. I thought, if you're going to get him to be the coach, that's one thing. Why would you want him as an executive? He had never done a job like this before. Mm-hmm. He was about 68, 69, but unfortunately an old 68, 69 because he's had some serious health issues. And he wasn't doing a lot of traveling. To do that job the right way, you got to grind, man. Mm-hmm. That job is not easy, especially when you have never done it before. Pat Riley's at a stage where he can delegate to people. But when it's on you to rebuild a franchise from the ground up, you got to work at it. He just didn't have it in him. He was never traveling. And then there was one point during the season where he went away to Woodstock. This was during the year. And he was tweeting out photos of some little cabin he was staying in. It's I remember writing, the guy went on spring break. The season is happening. The Knicks are terrible. He just, to me, did not have the right mindset. They got him way too late. He did it for a payday. It's unfortunate how it worked out for everybody, because I think it certainly tarnished his legacy a little bit. I think The Last Dance was good for Phil Jackson. He looked good in that.
Yeah, no, you can go back there. Well, look, you mentioned Riley delegating. He delegates some, but, again, like you said, he was still in the bubble. He found a way. He's not in the bubble. He's sort of doing what is the equivalent of the media tier 2 thing, right? But but he still was there. He got himself up there. He doesn't need to be there, but I think he's there in part so that what Jimmy Butler did after game 1 happens, right? Where Jimmy looks up and knows, that he's watching us. And I still think there's a certain,
I was going to say, the one thing about Pat Riley, about Phil Jackson, which always struck me in New York, listen, he's got an arrogance about him, which is well earned. He's won all those championships, but he was the kind of guy that never would say, when I had Michael in Chicago, he never mentioned Michael Jordan's name. I always used to think, why wouldn't you mention that? You coached the guy. You guys had unbelievable success. That always struck me as kind of odd, where it was almost like he thought maybe Michael was getting too much credit for us winning. He would never tell any story where he'd mention Michael Jordan. Well, when we were in Chicago, Michael did this or Michael did that. Never. No, it's the guy didn't even exist.
Whereas Riley, will summon the Magic name a lot. Always has. And I do think that's the one place where I think Pat didn't sort of rise to where he wanted in comparison to what Phil did. And part of it is because he wasn't coaching him, is that the Riley-LeBron relationship never developed into what I and others anticipated it would develop into. There clearly was communication between the two of them and all the rest, but it's even, the Riley quote before LeBron left, the famous one where it was kind of revealed that LeBron's wife was pregnant, and that pissed off LeBron's people because there was some stuff that wasn't supposed to get out at that press conference. And, do you have the guts? That was the press conference. And, LeBron's people about 20 minutes later were blowing up reporters' phones saying, did he just effing say that? And so that one didn't go particularly well. But the one thing he said at that presser was, he said, LeBron and I have a texting relationship. And the relationship with LeBron never became, again, because he didn't coach him, never became what his relationship with Magic was, what his relationship to some degree was with Dwayne, what it certainly was with Patrick, and some of the other greats that he coached. So, you talk about the two greatest players of all time. Phil had that relationship. I think Pat wanted to have it with LeBron, but it never quite got there. To me, that's one of the other differences.
Do you also think that maybe all along LeBron knew that he'd be leaving at some point?
No. At some point, absolutely. At some point, absolutely. And when I look back at 2012, and I always will feel like an idiot because I was in Cleveland covering that team, and LeBron said something. They were working out at a practice gym up there. It was during the Lynn stuff. I remember it was that period. I think it was the 12-13. It was during that period, and LeBron was asked about Cleveland, and he kind of opened the door to coming back. And I remember talking to people around LeBron right after, like, no, he didn't mean to do that, and I bought it. But as we know, when you look back at it at the time, he was already kind of setting the stage for that. And I think he always intended to go back. I think there were a lot of excuses that were made for why he left in 14, and some that have never really been written and talked about that were legitimate. But I think it was a combination of things. But I do think it blindsided Riley and the Heat. I was talking players who played with LeBron were telling me all week in 14, he's gone. I don't know why you're not writing it. He's gone. He's out of there. He's not staying. He's pissed about this. He wants to do this. And yet I would talk to people at very high levels at the Heat, and they're like, no, he's staying. We're fine. There was a definite disconnect at the end.
I don't like the way that he handled it, though. I think, what was the story about Vegas where he was, when they met with him, he was just watching the World Cup that was on?
He was watching soccer. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, come on.
It was not the best. And that first year after he left, I was assigned to cover him in Cleveland, of all things, for Bleacher Report. And it was funny because I would be making the trips back and forth. And whenever I'd see him up there, and it was a little more restrictive media-wise, but I would get some one-on-ones with him, or he'd just walk-offs. And whenever he'd say, what the F did Ryle say about me now? Like, I remember the smiling faces with hidden agendas comment.
Oh, we played that on the radio all the time. I love that one.
Well, the other thing he did was, you remember that famous Muhammad Ali cover with him, kind of taking the arrows. I forgot what magazine it was in. Anyway, LeBron forgot too because he had the wrong magazine. He thought it was SI. It wasn't SI. I think it was Esquire actually. But I remember that day because I was up there listening to the Riley presser, but I was in Cleveland, and so he said the smiling faces with hidden agendas comment, and then I had to go to Cavs practice, and so I didn't ask him about it, but Joe Varden asked him about it. And so I was sort of standing in the back. I couldn't get that close to him because he was crowded. But as we walked away, he pulled me aside, and that's what he said. What the F did Ryle say about me? And I said, well, I just watched. I wasn't there, obviously, LeBron. I was here. I'm in Cleveland, but I saw the presser. This is what he said. And he goes, you ever see that cover of Muhammad Ali on SI where all the arrows are going through him? That's me. And I was like, okay.
He's always got to be the martyr. Oh, my God.
So that's kind of how that played out. Well, Frank, listen, great stuff. Appreciate it. Follow him on when he's on PTI, also Around the Horn, the Frank Isola on Twitter, and of course Sirius XM NBA. Was it every day 7 to 10? Is that
7
right?
7 to 10 every day.
Right, I'm still available to you, Frank.
All right, we got it. We always have fun when you come on. We'll have to get you on this week.
All right, grab me at some point. But thanks for doing it, man. Appreciate it.
Ethan, I really appreciate it, and good talking to you. Stay safe, and I'll talk with you soon.
You too.
Thank you for listening to the Five on the Floor on the Five Regional Sports Network.